Sketchbooks. You know them, you love them, or perhaps you don't. Maybe they are something lovely you return to time and time again. And maybe they are something you got forced into when you were in school. I required them as a part of my art classes for over a decade, and would often start the first or second day of class with distributing them. This object then became the singular connection for each student between the classroom and their personal life, and most made good use of them. Of course, with the middle school students, I would frequently find several a day simply left in the classroom, but I suppose that is to be expected. Here on the internets, however, things seem to always erupt onto opposing sides. You have many who have been pushing the importance of sketchbooks for ages, and now a new rising group protests them, calls them vile and destructive, and that's pretty much why I'm here today. I want to talk about and defend sketchbooks. I think they are a lovely addition, and though perhaps not essential, well, no, actually, I do think that they're essential to your artistic life, and your artistic life will be worse without them, but we'll get into that. Well, my name is Zach, and welcome to episode 84 of the podcast. Today we're talking about sketchbooks, really from a general perspective and the benefits they bring to you as the artist. As we get started, let me know in the comments, how many sketchbooks are you currently working on? How many do you currently have in some strange, unfinished state? And don't be shy, there's no shame here. And at the end, I'll talk about my current situation so you'll know how overboard this can get. Feel free to check out the Discord and Patreon link below as well as we get started. So, sketchbooks. What is a sketchbook? I generally like to start these kinds of talks off with that. Now, in this case, it's something that we all have a really firm idea in our mind of what they are, but I kind of want to start by breaking it down by its purpose, not the actual physical object. So, a sketchbook is a resource where you are able to sort out ideas, work out the preliminary components of a larger piece, work on the go, cover up your work both for safety and privacy reasons, and ideally handle several different mediums. It is sometimes used for full pieces, but more often for sketching, quick drawings, studies, and lower stakes pieces. These aspects, I believe, are essential, and although I'm likely missing something crucial here, this seems to be the bare minimum, and a good place to start. Now, the first thing I think we have to state is that sketchbooks can take many forms. Not only can the books be quite different in size, binding shape, weight, and paper type, they can also not be literal books. If you have an iPad or a drawing tablet that gives you all or most of these qualities, then that could function as your sketchbook, with the caveat that you are not always creating large-scale projects only, but also working on the titular sketching now and again. So why are they important? Why am I even recording this today? First of all, I think it's important to think about these things, especially with art, a tradition that's been around for thousands of years. It's easy to find ourselves doing the same thing we've always done only because that's traditional, because it's something that we as artists are expected to do. It's always good every once in a while to take a break, to look at what you're doing and evaluate, to make sure that it's still a good and reasonable strategy for you. It's a component that is involved in most art classes, and obviously if you just look on this platform alone for sketchbook tours, sketchbook sessions, you will find a tremendous amount of things. So obviously as a community, it's tied up in what it is to be an artist. And there are pieces of that that are good and pieces of that that are not so good. But let's start by talking about why sketchbooks in general are so important, some of the benefits that they bring to you as an artist. The first one here is availability and transportation. So having a sketchbook, just literally having the physical object, means that you already have a compact, transportable art workstation. For me, this is as simple as shoving my sketchbook into my backpack. I pretty much always keep one there, generally two, but always at least one. This means that wherever I go, I always have the ability to engage in art if I end up with a couple extra minutes. And this happens a lot more frequently than I thought it would. Often nowadays, we fill this time with scrolling on our phones. And while there's nothing wrong with that, we can easily fall into the trap of doing that so frequently that we run through hours a week that could be spent in another pursuit. So often I will just have my backpack with me and end up with a couple extra minutes at the doctor's office or dentist's office. Sometimes when I arrive to pick up my daughter after school, I'm a little bit too early. I always have a resource to work on. Sometimes in between running errands, I can pop into a coffee shop. The transportability of a sketchbook is a fundamental component of it. But this also transitions into long drives, into going on a vacation or a plane. Anytime you're going somewhere for an extended period of time, or even if you're just going to school or to work, a sketchbook is something that allows you to work in any environment. And this is a big deal if you work on things like I do, where I often have a ton of art supplies. I have large-scale sketchbooks or paper that cannot be moved. If I wasn't actively thinking about having a resource so I could work anywhere, I basically would only work in my little studio space here. So this can be a lovely aspect of a sketchbook, and fortunately, just the way that sketchbooks are built as being a small physical object, this is something that comes innately with them. In general, this is going to push you towards having a little kit of traveling gear, and I actually had a video about this recently, which I will link below, if you are looking at just some advice on having a little kit that you take with you when you are just going out and running errands, or whether you're going on vacation or things like that. But that's a really important and just fundamental aspect of sketchbooks. They allow you to work places that are not your normal or even ideal setup, and this is just going to translate to more time invested in your artwork. Sometimes when you're out and about and you're doing things, inspiration strikes, and it's good to always have a resource there to engage with it. The next thing, and I think probably the most important across the board, is that a sketchbook is a record of past work. This is different than just having a stack of projects that you finished, because the sketchbook itself is going to hold together as a tangible object. It often keeps things safer, which I will touch on later, but it's also going to keep it all relegated to some manner of basic chronological order. So it's a record of your history. When you jump back into a sketchbook that you finished months ago, or in my case, 2 decades ago, you can see who you were at that point in time. This is really intriguing for a lot of aspects. You can see how your skills have progressed over the years. But if you're like me, one of the coolest parts is seeing what your mind was occupied with at that time. I can go back and generally see what kind of novels I was reading, the cartoons or anime that I was watching, the video games that I was playing. Because I am also a writer and a world builder, it's very exciting to go back and see where a lot of these ideas started. Obviously, I started building some of my stories when I was in high school, and my drawings now are far better than they were back then. So I often get a chuckle when I look at like my first iteration of a character, or my first attempt at drawing a robot or a dragon. There is some nostalgia in that. And I think for artists, because our work is so often emotionally bound, it can be really wonderful to engage with that past version of yourself. The other side of this, though, is that if you are keeping a good record of your artwork, you're finishing sketchbooks semi-regularly, 1 or 2 a year even, you can go back and look at things that were inspiring and motivating to you several years back. When I look at my sketchbooks from middle and high school, I don't get much of this. But when I go back to my sketchbooks from 2 or 3 years ago, I can often find sketches that are super cool and can be updated and can be incorporated into new things. I had a lot of ideas in prior years when I wasn't so focused on making sure everything was of a certain caliber. I struggle with certain things like composition, and so I will tend to practice it a lot. That makes me sometimes a little bit stiff in how I approach particular things. And so if I go back to before I was focusing on those things, sometimes the compositions and the illustrations are wild and they're kind of untamed. So it's really good to go back and see that older work. And sometimes I'm inspired by the work that I did a long time ago. In fact, as I move forward in some of the future world building episodes, I'm going to have to go back and revisit sketches of old things, because some of those ideas I labored on so long that they really are well developed. And those are only kept alive and recorded because I have the sketchbooks. They were in a location where they weren't just a loose paper that got thrown to the wayside. So that record of your past work, I think, is one of the most fundamental and beautiful aspects of sketchbooks. It's harder to imbibe of that in the moment. It's very much a future-oriented thing. When you are sitting down and working on your sketchbook right now, especially if your normal tendency is to do something very different from that, especially if your normal tendency is digital, it can feel a little bit different. I'll actually take a moment here though and talk about digital sketchbooks. The way that I have handled this in the past is I will just pull up whatever application it is I'm using for drawing, whether that's Photoshop or Krita or Procreate, and I will create a massive drawing. Sometimes this is 10,000 by 10,000 pixels, whatever the program can handle. And then I'll just zoom in on a portion of it and I will sketch out ideas. And I will treat this singular document as a sketchbook until I fill up the entirety of it, and then I will just move on and open a new one. But I'm really curious if any of you have done any digital sketchbooking, what that looks like, if there's an application for it or anything along those lines. The next really beneficial thing about sketchbooks is that by their nature, they encourage practice. Having a space dedicated to less perfect things makes it a little bit easier expectation-wise to dive into those things. If all of the stuff that you have lying around is for professional or for student grade material, it can be very hard to kind of waste your time, as it were. This might look like you have a whole bunch of canvases for creating paintings, but because those are all potentially a finished painting at some point down the line, it's a little bit harder to wrap your head around using one of those for just practicing and experimenting. You can very much feel the pressure, especially economic pressure, to make sure that each of those is utilized in the best way possible. But if you have a sketchbook dedicated specifically toward sketching, toward practicing things, you're going to find it much easier from an economic standpoint and from an expectation standpoint to dive into that, to try new things. We all know intrinsically that trying new things and experimenting is a fundamental component of art. It's likely what got us excited about it in the first place, but also we tend to fall into a rut. We tend to find a pathway for art that works for us. We come back to it time and time again. It's just a very natural thing. I don't know if it's more natural for artists than it is for normal folk, if you will, but it seems very much to be a part of what it is to be an artist. We love experimenting and trying new things, and yet we also just kind of accidentally / love falling into our routines and our ruts. So this can be a really good methodology to encourage yourself to practice on things. Also, when you have space dedicated to a specific thing, you're more likely to do that thing. This might seem really logical, but I find that it's true. If you have stuff set up, it's more likely that you're going to engage in it because there's less friction to that entry point. If I were to show you right now my studio area right to the right of where I'm recording, which is this little like 18 by 36 inch desk that I bought from a school that I worked at for a long time, I've got tons of jars on that and on the shelves next to it that contain all of my brush pens, my drawing pens, and pencils and assorted things like that. The reason I have those all out and accessible is because in the moment, I don't want to stop what I'm doing and go open something up and find the particular color I'm looking for. But because it's there, because I have access to it, because I know that it's a resource, I use it. Your sketchbook is the same thing when it comes to practice and experimentation. If you have that resource available, you're far more likely to use it. It becomes much harder if you are mid-project and then you go, I really want to hash this out and work out what this would look like. You've got to go scramble and find some paper and some resources and things like that. If you have the space already dedicated to that, it's going to be far easier for you to bridge that gap. And this practice, this sketching ahead of time, the prepping for things, if you don't do this, I would highly encourage you to engage in it. I've talked before on the channel about how I would encourage / require my students to have several sketches before they dived into a project, dived, and then I would also make sure that they sketched out a full iteration of whatever it was before they began the final version. This is because in that moment when you're excited about starting something new, you're kind of blinded by that excitement. It's almost like, when your friend has a crush or they really like somebody and they're missing all of these potential red flags. But in that moment, they can't see it. They've got these goggles on that they're just like, oh my goodness, this person is wonderful. The same thing happens with drawing and artistic projects. We dive into it, we're so excited, and we're missing all these red flags that could be taken care of in that case. You can't necessarily fix the person you're trying to date, but you can fix the drawing or the art project before you engage in it. by doing some more studies, by doing some sketches and some prep, working out the composition, trying to figure out the perspective, honing your color knowledge before you dive in, looking up some references. All of these things can be done that way. And so if you are not using a sketchbook at all, or not using a sketchbook for that purpose, I would highly encourage you to do so, to start working on a little bit more prep work before you dive into things. A lot of the drawings that you see me do here, especially the highly detailed ones, they pretty much all have a sketch as part of them. And, honestly, that feels a little weird sometimes when I'm showing these drawings in the background of the podcasts and whatnot, because my sketchbooks, the actual sketchy sketchbooks where I just put in anything into them, they're often kind of a mishmash of beautiful, cool drawings, half-finished things, and really ugly sketches. My first sketches of things are generally really hard to read because I'm just trying to work out silhouettes and shadows and shapes and negative space. But I don't share a lot of that here. I do on some of my sketchbook tours. In fact, I will link below a real sketchbook and what it looks like, and it has a lot of studies. It has a lot of stuff that's messy and kind of gross. This sketchbook, I'm working on things specifically in a particular tone. Everything in this is ink. It's got a lot of my Inktober pieces and Smogist pieces. I love this sketchbook, but unfortunately, I have turned this sketchbook into a collection of a lot of finished pieces, which means that, frankly, I wouldn't consider this sketchbook a traditional sketchbook. A sketchbook by its nature should allow for the preparatory work before you engage in something. In this one, that's almost always done with pencil sketches underneath stuff, and then I will erase them after I finish the drawing. So hopefully I'm not being too hypocritical there, but again, as we get to the end of this episode, I'll talk about all of my sketchbooks, and I think that will make all of this make a little bit more sense. But the fact that a sketchbook is the resource for you to practice, to study things, and also encourages you to do that is a wonderful boon for sketchbooks in general. Likewise, they encourage experimentation. If you have a resource that is not expensive compared to all your other art making supplies, it's a space that is, open, and there's so many extra pages and you can do anything there, and you kind of in the back of your head know I can pull out that piece and throw it away if everything goes wrong. Though I really would discourage you from ever tearing a page out of your sketchbook. Please don't do that for many, many reasons. Having that knowledge in the back of your mind and that space dedicated means it's far more acceptable to experiment and to try new things. It's easier to get out of your comfort zone when you know that there's just not that big a risk. Sometimes, especially in my mixed media sketchbooks, I will just layer thing upon thing to see what happens. Only recently did I realize that ballpoint pen will eventually dry enough that you can go with other ink or watercolor or brush pens over it. I just didn't really know because I work so hastily most of the time that I would never let it dry enough to come back and work over it. When I have a sketchbook specifically dedicated toward experimentation and mixed media and trying all these things, all of a sudden I end up with a sketchbook that by the time I get to the end of it, it's got 6 or 7 different mediums in it. This is important, I think. It's going to be something that doesn't really have a good interface point for digital artwork, but if you're working traditionally, there is a lot to be said for overlapping your mediums. My favorite, and I've talked about it here before, and I'm going to do some videos on it here soon, is mixing watercolor and ink. These two mix tremendously well because they're so different, so opposing to one another. Watercolor is so gradual. One thing fades into another softly. It's got this almost lyrical quality to it. It's got very little precision unless you're really working hard to get it that way, but it likes to kind of flow. You can't control 100% of watercolor unless you're exceedingly good at it. And yet ink is the exact opposite side. It's often a singular tone unless you're really working hard to distribute that. It's very precise. The lines are very, very clean. But imagine taking watercolor over this drawing that I'm working on right now, over this robot. Once it's 100% dry, you can take watercolor over that, and all of these colors are going to give an extra quality of life to the piece. And it's really, really wonderful. That experimentation happens in a resource that is specifically dedicated toward that manner of experimentation. Yes, it can occur other places, but when you have a space dedicated to something, you're more likely to use it. Don't underestimate the dopamine of new supplies. If you are an artist, I likely don't need to tell you this, but it's exciting to get a new thing. Sketchbooks are a new thing. If you're working digitally, if you're working on canvases all the time, it's not necessarily exciting to go buy a new canvas in the same way that it's like, oh my goodness, look at the binding on this thing, feel the paper. Sketchbooks are exciting. And as art primarily ought to be done for joy, you shouldn't underestimate the excitement and the joy and the dopamine that you get from getting a new sketchbook. It can be something that kind of propels you forward. If you're anything like me, when I get a new sketchbook, I'm often so excited to get into it that I make, 10% progress through the entire book in that first week or two, just because I'm so excited. My tan sketchbook, which I'll mention again later when I talk about my own personal situation, is probably my favorite sketchbook ever. And yet I've had it for like 2.5 years and have not completed it yet. But I did a ton of work in it at the beginning. And that's just kind of how it goes. We are excited about new things. We dive into them. Now, this could also put you in a position where you've got a dozen unfinished sketchbooks because you keep buying new ones and diving in. I'm not sure this is necessarily a bad thing unless it's financially impacting you in a really negative way. But that's another nice aspect about sketchbooks is that they're not super expensive. Yes, you can buy an extremely expensive sketchbook, but most of the time, they are not super expensive. I think the most expensive one I've ever purchased was $30, maybe $40 here in the US. Most of mine are right around 10 or 15 bucks. I often try to wait until they're on sale, and then I'll pick up a whole bunch of them and store them. So later on, when I'm counting how many I'm actively using, I'm just counting how many I'm actively using. I probably have an additional 10 or 15 sketchbooks that are like still in their packaging, just on a shelf behind me. This is just because I don't like finishing a book and then having to wait until I can get the next one. The next benefit here is safety. So a sketchbook has a hard cover almost always. Sometimes it has a soft cover, but that will serve, the same kind of purpose, just a little bit less well. What this does is naturally protect your pieces. When that sketchbook is closed, most of the things inside are protected. Even if you're to spill liquid on top, the cover will distribute a lot of that liquid, and the liquid will only get in on the edges. Whereas if you're working on larger pieces, those pieces are subject to all kinds of pain and torment. I've accidentally dropped things on paintings. Things have bumped into paintings before. But when I've dropped a sketchbook, when I've spilled something on a sketchbook, when my sketchbook has, been stolen, just like somebody messing with me in high school and run around with it, it doesn't get damaged. Even if the sketchbook itself gets damaged, the material inside doesn't. This is perhaps a superficial thing or a really trite aspect of sketchbooks, but they do protect your work in a tremendous way. And this is not something that should be overlooked, especially if you work digitally and you use expensive supplies or carry around a $1,000 iPad when you're doing your artwork. Maybe sometimes you're going into an environment where you don't want to risk that. Taking a sketchbook that cost you $10, probably going to be a better option. The bindings can actually protect pieces as well. I am hesitant to say, but I learned recently that if you use the spiral bound sketchbooks, which is always what I used growing up because the pages move better, that they smudge your drawings far more, which makes a ton of sense because the pages rub against each other because the binding allows them to do so. So when I have shifted recently to most of my sketchbooks being just center bound so the papers can't move side to side, my pencil drawings aren't smudging as much. My ink drawings are only smudging, if I close the sketchbook too quickly. But this is a lovely thing. So you can actually protect your drawings by making sure that they've got a good binding to them. This is something that if you're just doing drawings on loose pieces of paper and putting them in a box somewhere, they will inevitably smudge onto one another a little bit. So this is another aspect of a sketchbook that keeps your pieces safe. It's much easier to transport a sketchbook generally than it is to transport loose artwork. Like I said, I throw my sketchbooks into my backpack all the time. When I pull them out, I'm not gingerly setting them down on the dining room table. They are getting slammed around and thrown around, and although I try to be fairly careful with them, they kind of get banged up over time. But you know what? It doesn't matter. This sketchbook that I'm working on here, I've had for, a year and a, no, not quite a year. And I've carried it across the country once or twice, and it has basically no damage. It's got some dings on the side, but none of my pieces are damaged, and it's a very reliable sketchbook. This one also has a pretty sturdy, heavy cover and actually has a strap that keeps the cover kind of elastically bound shut. But again, this was just a $15 sketchbook from Hobby Lobby, nothing crazy. Bristol paper, which I love, heavy duty paper, wonderful for ink drawing. Doesn't take watercolor that well, but it handles ink really, really well, and it handles pens and those kinds of things particularly well. So this is kind of a side point here, but I found over the years that a lot of people, primarily young people, but not only young people, use their sketchbooks like journals. Sometimes they are containing drawings or even writing that is about sensitive topics, traumatic topics. Sometimes they'll be used in therapy to work through things that you are struggling with just as a human being. And you know what a sketchbook has that a lot of other artistic things don't? Is the ability to be closed quickly. Now, obviously this could be used in a malicious way, where you're doing things that are bullying other people, but I am going to assume for a moment that you as an artist are probably not doing this. You are probably just a normal human being who sometimes works on things that other people think are dark or macabre, and they're really just your own joy, or they're your way of working through things in a therapeutic sense. I don't want to underestimate the ability to close your sketchbook, to just put things away. If you don't want to have that conversation at that moment, if you're worried what that person might think, it allows you to close a thing. Could this be abused and, done in a negative way? Yeah, but so could most things. And for some people, it's a huge boon. It also weathers the elements reasonably well. So when I am working outside, every once in a while I've taken a canvas to go paint outside. And as much as I love the idea of doing that, I struggle with the wind and the dust and the bugs messing with things. But a sketchbook, again, weathers this pretty well. It's a pretty compact object, so if you're going to go on a hike and do some sketching, it fits in your backpack or under your arm really, really well, and it's really good for those kinds of things. And again, it can be closed quickly so that it can weather a light rain or wind or things like that without taking any real damage. The last thing here about the benefits of a sketchbook is just the fact that it's personal to you as a human. By nature, it is a physical object. It's something that can be adorned with artistry, with stickers, or other tangible objects that make it yours. I come to know each sketchbook like an old friend, and often it feels akin to booting up an old video game or a Nintendo system. Each of them has unique traits, and I've got memories and emotions tied up in each of them. I think this is something especially because art is such an emotionally bound up thing that cannot be underestimated. A sketchbook is personal. It has a life of its own. Because it's a physical object, you will inevitably get things on it that you didn't intend. Your makeup might get on it. You might spill something. You might smudge something. Your friend might take it from you and write something. So many other art forms don't have any corollary to this at all. If you're working digitally, there's almost no aspect of this. If you're working on large projects all the time, same thing goes. There's basically no correlation there. But this is a physical, tangible object. It's something that you can fall in love with, something that gets worn and memories build up in it as you tote it around. I don't really know what's happening. It's such an ethereal thing. But when I pick up a sketchbook from years ago, it is a nostalgia bomb. I am immediately back to who I was and where I was at the moment that I worked on this. Emotions come flooding back. And I think this just happens because every moment you pour into that sketchbook gets bound up in those pages. And it can be personalized. It can be this thing that is just you. It is uniquely you in that moment. The sketchbooks that I'm working on right now, I know a decade from now, when I'm 48 years old, I'm staring down 50, I will open these sketchbooks and they will bring me back to the beginning of this channel, wherever I have gone at that point. I'll be able to look back on sketches and remember sitting at the dining room table and doing them with my 5-year-old daughter, who will at that point be 15 years old. Who knows what life will be like at that moment, where I will live, how life will have kind of played out. But in that moment, I'll be able to jump back and I'll be able to be with that younger version of myself. And the sketchbook does this not just because it's that record, like I mentioned earlier, but there's something intangible and unique about it. It is a personal, physical object. And whether you are a spiritual person or otherwise, it seems that there is something ethereal bound up in them. Well, what about my take on this, my kind of personal side of it? So you might have gathered from this episode so far, I love sketchbooks. I have so many of them. I laid all of them out at one point not that long ago. I mean, now it was like a year ago, but They took up a whole rug here in my basement. I might have had 20 or 30, and I kind of keep just expanding on that because the channel is, kind of forcing me to work on them much, much more frequently. But I really enjoy the idea of having a sketchbook for each thing. I like organization, I love spreadsheets, and so in my mind, the way that I should operate with sketchbooks is like, this is my pencil sketchbook, this is my pen sketchbook, this is my anything sketchbook, this is my world building sketchbook for this story. And that's how I want to do it. In the past, when I've done that, I find that I freeze up. I get overwhelmed. In that moment, I might want to draw a robot, and it's like, oh, I don't have my robot sketchbook, so I just don't draw it. So I've come to the conclusion that I need to be a little bit more open-handed about how I use my sketchbooks. Now, that said, I still kind of get excited about them and accumulate more than I need to, and I'm always working on more than one at a time. There's a piece of this that is good, and there's a piece of this that is not so good. So I currently have 9 sketchbooks that I'm working on regularly. 3 large ones in addition to this that I don't really consider sketchbooks. See more like reservoirs of paper. So I'm going to go through these real quick. I'm not going to show them on the screen because it would take a long time, but if you look through any of my past videos, you'll see each of them peek out a little bit. So the first one is my world building sketchbook, which is actually what I started doing the world building sessions on. And that sketchbook is a small square Bristol sketchbook. It's beautiful. I love it. It is going to take forever to finish because I got maybe a dozen pages in, realized I didn't have a lot of the ideas conceived, and because I had been doing it in such a beautiful fashion, where that sketchbook is supposed to appear to be an explorer going through a region and documenting everything, I was like, oh, well, I have to have these ideas developed first. So that actually led to the second sketchbook, which is my backup world building sketchbook. And in this one, I'm allowed to just draw anything. I can draw any region, I can work on characters or weapons or structures, and that's the one that you're predominantly seeing in the world building sessions now. That sketchbook will eventually serve as the resource to fully do the first one. But it's been really freeing just to be able to draw with anything in there, and I'm allowed to have bad drawings, which is something I've talked about a lot. So that's me implementing my own advice. The third is my ink sketchbook, which is the one that you're actually watching in the background here. It contains mostly robots, Smogus 2024, and many of the Inktober 2024 drawings. This one is just a larger version of my first world building sketchbook. It's a square 10x10, I believe, Bristol sketchbook. It's lovely. I got both of those two at Hobby Lobby, and it's just a wonderful sketchbook. I really, really enjoy it. The fourth is my tan sketchbook, which I think is my favorite sketchbook ever. It is wonderful. It is made by Niltech, which I think is a family-owned like small business, and they hand make maybe they don't hand make them, but they make these specialty sketchbooks. It is ridiculous. If you need like one sketchbook, that's the one I would recommend. The tan paper is amazing because I can work in both light and dark on it. I can go any direction, and it's kind of that mid-tone. But that is probably my favorite sketchbook. I need to get back to it and finish it here soon. The fifth is a Moleskine sketchbook, which is great, but I've dedicated it to pencil now, and I just kind of keep forgetting to work on pencil. I bought it because there's a lot of hype about those sketchbooks, and sometimes, you probably have done this too. I'll buy something because it's hyped, and then I'm kind of let down because, oh, it didn't miraculously solve like every issue I was having artistically. So don't expect your new purchases and sketchbooks to do that. It's a really good sketchbook. I used it probably on this channel most famously for my anime video the first year I opened the channel, and it's good, but it seems to be really best for pencil and ballpoint pen sketches. Eventually I'll get back to it and I'll finish it, but it's low priority right now. The sixth is a pen and ink sketchbook I use mostly for prep for instructional videos. Very simple. The seventh is a standard sketchbook specifically for studies and practice only. This is a recent edition. I haven't used it much. It's just a standard drawing sketchbook, and it's just, oh, I need to study parrots for this. I need to study how a dragon is put together. I'm going to go copy a bunch of people's robots. That's what that sketchbook's for. The eighth is a mixed media sketchbook that just doesn't really know its own identity. It's a weird one. I'm not particularly happy with it, but I'm far enough in that it's just time to finish it. It only has 30 pages total because they're pretty thick, so I just need to finish that one up and be done with it. The ninth is my All Things Go sketchbook. It's a mixed media one that I just got recently after I finished up one of my favorite sketchbooks ever that I will actually link below. It was my mixed media sketchbook from, I think, 2023 and 2024. But I actually have a sketchbook tour for it. So I will link that one below. I'm really happy with the results in that sketchbook, and that sketchbook in general was a really good resource. So I got another recently to kind of replace that, and so I have a sketchbook where I'm just allowed to draw anything I want with any medium I want, which maybe sounds silly, but I have a tendency to try to organize things. And so having a resource that is just an anything goes resource for me is something that I need. Well, goodness, I am likely forgetting one or three, but that's my current loadout at present. Thanks for being here for this session. I hope that it was informative. If you are using a sketchbook already, I hope it was kind of, reinforcing what you're doing. If you don't use sketchbooks much, I would really strongly encourage you to get one. Just don't overburden yourself with it. Don't buy an expensive one, buy something simple and keep your expectations low. I've just seen so much content in the last year about how sketchbooks are not a good thing to use anymore. And I think some of that comes from people trying to turn them into a single piece where everything inside it is beautiful. And that could certainly lead new artists to have a strange and odd and detrimental view of what a sketchbook is. So I can understand from that perspective, it's not a good thing. But in general, sketchbooks are a great, fundamental, beneficial tool. And I would encourage any artist, young, old, brand new, or at this for ages, you should work in sketchbooks. They're good for you. Well, again, thanks for being here. Thanks to my patrons as well, who are on the screen right now. If you want to check out my Patreon, it is linked next to the Discord server in the description down below. Well, have a good one, y'all. See you soon.